We have Habitat Conservation Subcommittee workshop update, place-based on the fishery conservation in Charlotte Harbor, Florida. This presentation will be given by Corey Anderson, and then we'll have. There's no the purpose of this is to provide an update on the initial progress of the Habitat Conservation Subcommittee workshop following the first workshop on November 19th. This relates to fish, wildlife, habitat protection priority area of the CCMP. And the Habitat Conservation Subcommittee workshop update, place-based recreational fishery conservation in Charlotte Harbor. And so how is this going to be? Corey's going to be presenting this
virtually.
Virtually, correct. So
yes, I'm here online. Can you hear me all right, everyone?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Ernesto. This is an update on the first workshop of the Habitat Conservation Subcommittee, or HICS as the abbreviation is pronounced. First workshop of 4 planned, and this is focused around really drilling down into actions that we have for conservation, taking the HRN deeper into specific targeted conservation. Next slide, please. Again, project purpose is to extend the NEP's Habitat Restoration Needs Plan, really drill down into those conservation actions, things we can do on the ground by specific managers and influence specific policies. We're doing this project to leverage some newer fisheries research that informs research management. So we've focused on a very limited resource, which is discrete Charlotte County sportfish nursery habitats. These are areas generally circled here on the map that support the nursery habitat for snook and tarpon, 2 extremely important recreational fishery species. And this addresses a couple of the CCMP objectives there, fish, wildlife, and habitat, and also we're looking at hydrology. So as people may be aware, the Habitat Conservation Subcommittee comes together when there are as-needed projects and experts to advise the process of putting together a plan. In this particular planning project, we're looking for the HICS to guide a science co-production process. So I'll use that word a couple of times. That basically means getting management and resource managers together, voicing their resource management uncertainties, putting researchers with them to find out where we can come up with solutions to that, and then looking at conservation opportunities. And so this project is going to plan for applying the information gained to policies and conservation actions such as management or acquisition. Next slide, please. This HICS project is funded through a NOAA Restore Science Program grant to the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida. That's allowed us to procure a facilitator and a project coordinator. And so we're looking to define the habitat management issues and research needs around these specific sportfish nursery habitats. We want to understand their hydrology, their function better, and looking at the projected effects of human development and stormwater on the function of these habitats and their sustainability going forward. We're co-producing solutions, hopefully, as I said, so we want to look at efficient market-based policies such as conservation easements or transfer of density to conserve the areas that are not already in preservation, and then looking at potential ways that the county, Charlotte County, can help with zoning policies or strategic preservation, stormwater management, planning, and also habitat restoration actions. And the goal here, one of many goals, is to really inform Charlotte County's 2027 comp planning and also state management plans for such as FWC or Florida Forever. And there's the NOAA Restore Science Program grant number there at the bottom. This is a big partnership of all these organizations. Next slide, please. A little bit of background on the project. Charlotte Harbor is a quite unique estuary. So we've got large rivers, we've got a lot of passes, a lot of preserved shoreline already, which is great, tidal creeks and marshes. But the fishery scientists are really just discovering some more unique features that relate specifically to why snook and tarpon are especially abundant here and why they contribute to a multi-million-dollar annual recreational fishery, and that their habitats in their first year or a couple years of life really overlap with a lot of other sensitive species, including over 10 imperiled bird species and 55 important prey and sport fish species. Next slide, please. The fisheries research I talked about has revealed some real hotspots and some specific nursery areas for these two fish species that I mentioned. So Dave Blewett, who is in the room there, can tell you that there's been fisheries sampling for 25 years in Charlotte Harbor, and really adult snook are abundant in a few places. And of those few places, they never catch the juveniles there. So where are the juvenile fish? What habitat do they need? And how can we make sure that we preserve that so that we can maintain this abundant fishery? Well, Bonefish and Tarpon Trust has done some citizen science to locate what has turned out to be a limited number of these nursery sites, only 24 that they've found in Charlotte Harbor. Next slide, please. And so this just illustrates there's a sharp divide between where you find the adult snook and where you find the juvenile snook and juvenile tarpon. The juvenile snook and tarpon are really far inland in these pockmarked ponds in the landscape, and they swim up tidal creeks away from large predators like jacks and adult snook. And these areas, many of them are within the Buffer Preserve State Park, but also some of them are not preserved and at the edge of burgeoning development in Charlotte County. So these are really important areas to conserve if they're not already conserved, because they're really natural hatcheries. People think about stocking fish through hatcheries. That's labor intensive, cost intensive. This is natural areas that already do that for us, and we want to make sure to preserve them. Next, please. But these habitats are at risk. So as I mentioned, a lot of these places are coastal ponds and high up in tidal creeks. And you can see in this image that a lot of these places are platted out for development already. And with our current housing boom and future housing needs, we're looking at those things potentially affecting the quality and function of these habitats for these fish, which means it's going to impact the fishery and people's livelihoods down the line. So we want to see how we can maintain natural hydrology. Flooding is necessary for these areas, both during summer and during storm events. Plan for how these will deal with habitat migration and sea level rise, and then address these threats through certain policies and actions with the county. So we're working with Charlotte County's Planning and Zoning and also their Water Quality Department to look at some opportunities for policies such as density reduction, where we can make sure that stormwater management and easements or things like that can be effective tools to conserve areas, barring outright acquisition of areas. Next, please. So this is a slide on the progress. We had our first workshop meeting of 4 planned on November 19th. Through the Restore Science funding, we've been able to hire a team to really conduct the project for us and walk all the investigators through it. So it's led by Janicki Environmental, with Wildwood Consulting helping to facilitate, and then ESA, Environmental Science Associates, is helping with some of the planning and GIS work that we need. And we're sort of required by the grant to put out research plans and application plans, how we plan to go forward and what we plan to study, and also how we plan to apply that information. But while we're doing that, we're also looking for conservation opportunities now and in the next few years, while we work to make actionable outputs that can be put into county land planning. So our first workshop was a great success. If anybody wants details on that, you can please contact me. My email will be put up later. You can also contact Nicole. But we had 25 people attend virtually and in person. We gave a lot of the same background information in depth. We're currently in an information gathering phase, getting GIS data and relevant background literature on the fisheries science and also the land use planning, zoning policies. And we're looking to follow that up with 3 more meetings or workshops, looking at scoping of policy tools and research needs in February. Then really digging into that planning and putting the applications together the following June, and then trying to finalize that plan in August of next year. And those plans will really feed into research funding opportunities and comp planning amendments. So the NOAA Restore Science program already has plans to offer research funding for successful teams that come out of this planning exercise. And so we're looking at the next comp plan in about 6 or 7 years, and the needs there, and also how this synergizes with other initiatives like the Flatwoods Initiative. Next. As I mentioned, here's my email. We do have summaries of the first meeting going out, and video recording of the details and background for anybody who missed it but wants to view that. You can contact me or you can contact Nicole, and I'll take any questions.
Great. Excellent presentation. Boy, a lot of work. I am so impressed. All right. Anybody has any questions? I do have a question. If nobody's going to say a question, now that I'm a little more relaxed, let me ask you a question. What role does mosquito control ditches have in the juvenile population? Have you seen any correlation? Because there were ditches all over built a long time ago, and they're still there. Do you have any input on that?
Yeah, good question, Ernesto. So without going into the deepest of details, and Dave will probably love to chat with you about this after the meeting. Mosquito ditches can be really important habitat for some of these juvenile fish. They also have acted as conduits in areas that we have tried to drain historically and have allowed fish to get into new habitats. So we found that some areas that have been altered have been colonized by snook and tarpon and have become important nursery habitats going forward.
Good, good. I'm glad to hear this. Great. Well, if we don't have any more questions.
Oh, Corey, I was paddling up Myrtle Slough, which is from Shell Creek going into the Peace River. And it's a really shallow, thin little connection. It goes way up towards Bergmont Road. But then it opens up into a lake. And there was a bunch of snook and tarpon in this lake that only had the thinnest little thread of connection through this Myrtle Slough down to the Shell Creek and to the Peace River. So I just thought that was interesting about what you were talking about how these fish find their way up the most, small, thin water connections to these inland, larger water bodies. And it must be that connection is stronger during certain times of the year seasonally where they're able to get up there, because we could barely get our canoe, the water was so shallow. So I just wondered if you could just speak a little bit more about that and how you guys were able to identify, I don't know if that one's on your map of nursery areas or not, but how you were able to identify these areas inland that we need to focus on protecting. And is that something that can be made available to TAC members to look at, or is that something that's confidential at this point?
No, Jennifer, you're absolutely right. These species in particular have a life history that's very interesting that drives them to get very far up into the landscape places where you might not expect them, and even places that are seasonally connected over a marsh, where they're in the winter time, they are actually disconnected from the estuary, but it allows them sort of a safe space to grow. And the fisheries research conducted by FWC's Wildlife Research, Fish and Wildlife Research Institute has really been going on over the last decade or so, but really kicked into high gear in the last about 4 or 5 years. And it's been supported by Charlotte County through a Restore grant. They've been looking a lot at the Cape Hayes Peninsula, going through the State Park Preserve, often into some very hard to access areas, heavily mosquito laden, finding these areas. But we're also finding that some of the ponds and high creek areas that you mentioned are not in the preserve, and also in other areas, east wall of Charlotte Harbor. Like you say, Myrtle Slough is an interesting area to find them. So the other way that these things have been identified is the Bonefish Tarpon Trust did basically an angler survey of where are your fishing spots for these tiny things. And they've been able to locate some of them that way. The information that FWC has gotten is publicly available. So you can contact us. We if it's for a conservation purpose, we'd be happy to work with you. The information that Bonefish Tarpon Trust has collected, at this point, they are keeping under wraps, sort of have a confidential thing with their anglers who have disclosed locations. And they are allowing us to use that information when it will clearly benefit the resource and the fishery.
Thank you.
Hey, Corey. Corey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, Mark.
Hey, good to see you, even if it's virtual. It's been what, 20 months? So in person. Great workshop. I did listen in for at least part of the discussion when you held that. I think it's very interesting. I think it's certainly useful information for our agency. Remember that I work primarily in the federal regulatory arena to help conserve what's designated as essential fish habitat. And typically essential fish habitat, encompasses the key habitat species, key habitat types: mangrove, seagrasses, tidal marsh, oyster reef, etc. I'm just kind of curious though, Corey, did you see much Brazilian pepper there? Because unfortunately we don't have a mandate to protect Brazilian pepper, but we do fish habitat. And you will be hearing from me for some of these locations, because I definitely agree, not just Southwest Florida is poised for development. I think we're going to be seeing this throughout Florida and probably much of the Southeast. But I think
Absolutely, Mark.
I think
And you make a good
Go ahead.
point there that this is an issue all over the place. So we are starting focused in Charlotte County, but we hope to build a model that we can roll out to other places successfully with this project. We do see a fair amount of exotics and things other than mangroves in these areas. I will say, so these fish at later life stages do use habitat that overlaps with other trust species EFH. For example, red drum. What I've noticed in the designated areas for essential fish habitat is that the snook and tarpon are higher in the watershed than the EFH reaches.
Correct. I believe the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act defines EFH up through the uppermost reach of tide, if you will. And clearly there's hydrological connectivity between, like you said, the estuaries and these other areas. And I think we're probably going to see more of this, particularly with increased king tide events and increased sea level rise. So I think it's definitely something that needs to be considered. Certainly by our agencies and a lot of the other resource agencies as well. But great work, Corey. You'll definitely be hearing from me, because I'd like to, proactively use this information for the greatest conservation efforts here in Southwest Florida. So thanks for your efforts.
Thanks, Mark. We'd love to have you.
Corey, this is Dave. I just wanted to add that these habitats are coastal ponds, and they're fringed with red mangroves primarily, and most of the marsh that leads up to these ponds is black mangrove. So it's primarily mangrove.
But to your point, I would say that the area that I observed, it's a freshwater slough, and it goes up to pretty fresh lake, and there's Brazilian pepper along the way and everything like that, and yet they're utilizing that type of habitat too, I guess, in some instances.
I was curious, are those adult fish or juvenile fish?
We saw adult,
So like you saw a larger snook.
large, rolling,
Yeah, so
yeah.
That's what we kind of expect up the nurseries are primarily, they're closer to the passes.
Okay.
So as we're finding Cape Hayes and the eastern Charlotte Harbor, those are the primary nursery grounds. As there are some juvenile snook that make it up to the rivers, but it's very few.
Okay.
Just, it has to do with timing of water coming out of the rivers with larvae trying to move up into the estuary. So you've got, summertime is their spawning time. So that's why we see mostly juveniles towards the passes and not up in our rivers.
John.
Yeah, great work, Corey. Really important stuff on habitat conservation. John Kasanik was our keeper, and so just kudos to that. And I was curious if the county had been receptive to any of your recommendations in the context of habitat conservation, or if any comp plan changes have been initiated as a result of those recommendations to date.
Good question, John. So the county has been, Charlotte County has been exceptionally receptive to engaging and being on board. We have the planning and zoning manager and the water quality manager directly involved in the project, and one of the assistant county administrators plugged into the project as well. So FWC and BTT have brought them the information on these habitats, a lot of the background. I think the county staff is poised to take recommendations. We haven't formulated specific recommendations on habitat conservation yet. We are working through that process with these workshops, and they are, interested to bring that forward in comp plan amendments over the next couple of years, and then a revised comp plan in the 27-28 timeframe.
Great, thanks.
Right. If there's any other questions,